Well, welcome everyone as you're all coming in. We're excited to have you here this afternoon for Water, Immersion, and Community and Sarah Cameron Sunde's durational performance with the sea. This will be an artist talk from Sarah Sunda and a faculty panel that is co-sponsored by the Georgia Museum of Art, as well as our friends at the Wilson Center for Humanities and Arts at the University of Georgia. As you're all coming in, and before we get started, I want to point out a few things about our Zoom platform for today. The presenters will not be able to see or hear members of the audience, but at the bottom of your screen on that menu bar, you will see a Q&A button and a chat button. Please put any questions that you have for our presenters and panelists in the Q&A box whenever you'd like. You do that throughout the program, and we'll have time at the very end for our panelists and the artists to answer your questions. If you have questions or concerns with technical logistics, or if you need any help troubleshooting anything, you can leave those comments in the chat box. Our curator of education, Kellen Steinman, is here to assist with that. If you have any other comments you'd like to make in the chat, you can do that as well. If we happen to exceed our max capacity on Zoom, you will join an overflow live stream on YouTube. You can feel free to put comments or questions there, and we'll also have staff monitoring that, that comment area. It's my pleasure to introduce Sarah Cameron Sunde. She is an interdisciplinary artist and director who works at the intersection of performance, video, and public art. She has a BA in theater from the University of California, Los Angeles, and received her MFA in digital and interdisciplinary art practice from the City College of New York. And she is, of course, the creator of 36.5, a durational performance with the sea, which is an ongoing work begun in 2013 that has taken Sunda to 6 continents over the last 7 years, and the work still continues, as you'll hear. At each site, she stands in ocean water for a full tidal cycle as water rises to her chin and then recedes to her feet. The performance is both a radical call to reconsider our relationship with water as individuals, communities, and a species, but it's also, I think, a vision of hope and resilience with community-based action at the heart of this endeavor. We are fortunate to feature Sunda's 36.5 in a current exhibition at the Georgia Museum of Art. You can see our Dudley Gallery for Time-Based Media here. This installation began in mid-September with a performance that the artist did in the North Sea in the Netherlands, and then moved to the Bay of Bengal in Bangladesh. It will continue beginning next week with the Bay of All Saints in Brazil, and conclude in mid-December through January with Bodo Inlet in Kenya. We invite you to visit the exhibition in person, or if you're nearby, or join us for our 2 remaining 24-hour live streams, one of Brazil and then another of Kenya in mid-December and then mid-January. Also joining us today is a distinguished panel of faculty from the fields of fine art, urban planning and environmental design, oceanography, and music. We're thrilled to have them with us. And following an overview from the artist of her 36.5 project, I'll introduce the panel and turn the conversation over to their interdisciplinary perspectives on this project. Each of them will give about a 5-minute response to 36.5, and then we'll have a bit of time for further discussion and Q&A at the end. Thanks to you all, our audience, for being with us. We've got about 66 folks with us, so thank you all. Thanks for tuning in, and I ask all of you to join me in welcoming Sarah Cameron Sunde.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Jeff. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to switch over to the PowerPoint. There we go. All right, so I want to start by just acknowledging that I'm calling in from the island of Mannahatta in Lenape Hoking, which is the homeland of the Lenape, and that the Georgia Museum of Art and the University of Georgia sit on the homelands of the United Kituwa Band and Eastern Band of the Cherokee Nation, and the Muskogee Creek Nation. And in this moment, we are paying respect to the Lenape, Cherokee, and Muskogee Creek peoples, past, present, and future, and we acknowledge their continuing resilience and presence in their homelands and in the waters and throughout the diaspora. So 36.5, I'm honored to be here. Thank you so much for having me and for inviting me to share this work with all of you. So 36.5, a durational performance with the sea, was a poetic response to an event that happened in Lenapehoking in New York City. Hurricane Sandy hit New York City in 2012, and it really changed my perspective on many things. I realized that we were all vulnerable, that the city was just as vulnerable as our individual bodies. And I had, for many months, I was meditating or thinking on this, this image of, I had an image of a person running through New York City trying to make ends meet while the city sinks beneath her feet. And I was trying to work that image into another project that I was making. And then I ended up in Maine about 9 months after Hurricane Sandy and realized that the tides could be a metaphor for sea level rise, for a changing environment. I was really struck by the tidal cycle in Maine. And so the first work in 2013 really began as this poetic response to Hurricane Sandy. I decided to stand in this tidal area for a full tidal cycle. And I really didn't know if it was going to work. Like, I didn't know if I would be able to do it. My background as a director, and my initial impulse was, okay, who can I convince? I had this image, and then I thought, who can I convince to stand in the water for a full tidal cycle? And then realized very quickly that I was going to have to do it myself if I wanted to make this image happen. So here are the 9 images from that very first work in 2013. They're really all that remain. We took little snapshots of video, but it wasn't, you know, I didn't imagine it as the work that it's become now. So these are the 9 images that remain that show the 12-hour, 48-minute performance that occurred on August 15th, 2013. But as I was out there in the water, I had this real sense of the waters connecting all of us around the world, and that I needed to understand, if I was this little artist in New York City trying to think about sea level rise and climate change, what were people on the other side of the planet thinking about and feeling and doing, and what challenges were they going through in relationship to sea level rise and climate change? And I wanted to connect and try to look at things from a really hyper local perspective and from this global perspective. So I did 2 more sort of research works in Mexico. This is in Akumal Bay in Mexico, and then in San Francisco Bay, where I experimented with inviting people to stay under the water with me and beginning to really deepen that connection with community, trying to ask questions, ask people who I met serendipitously what their relationship to water was, and trying to build the work in a more full and more complex way, bring out the themes that were present. This is an image of Sasha Perchenko, a collaborator in San Francisco, and we developed this together, a sort of choreographic movement phrase to mark the passing of the hours. She began it very simply, and then throughout the performance, each hour was marked by many people joining and learning this choreography. In 2015, I went to the Netherlands, and this is the North Sea iteration, 36.5 North Sea. It was the first time that I filmed the entire work in real time, I realized that I really wanted to be able to share this work. I could tell that it was meaningful for the people who were experiencing it, and I wanted to find another way for it to, or I needed to find a way to translate it into another form, and realized that video was the means to actually be able to get it out to more people and be able to share it with more people. So I decided to film the entire event in real time. And it was, and so we did it with multiple perspectives. From multiple perspectives, I collaborated with a local filmmaker, Jonas de Witte, and we had an exhibition. I was working with this organization called Talk, and we had an exhibition with 4 different spaces in Amsterdam where we planned to show the work in multi-channel format within 10 days after the performance. So that kind of became the real framework. This is what I consider the first sort of fully formed work in the series, is the North Sea work, because it exists both as this performance work and then as this durational video work, which some of you may have seen at the first month of the exhibition in Georgia. Next, I went to Bangladesh. This is on St. Martin's Island, which is the southern tip of Bangladesh. And music became a really important part of the work. I worked with some wonderful people. This is Nasir playing his kamak, and Islam was a passerby, a recent refugee from Myanmar, actually, who played his mandolin to me for an hour in the morning, an hour in the evening. And Sumi is dancing. She is doing the human clock to mark the passing of the hours. And here's just a little behind the scenes view from, so you can see a camera and some of the locals watching. And this is the family that let us sort of camp out and use their space as our grounding for right next to where we went out in the water. Then I went to Brazil. This is in the Bay of All Saints, which is in Salvador, Bahia. So many things were important about working in Brazil. This location was particularly special because of how we have this view right out into the ocean, but you see the comunidade that is right here. This is Solar de União. And I worked with a group of street poets through collaborator Clara Dominguez. I was connected to a bunch of street poets. Lev Brisa is here in the photo with me, and she did this amazing contemplé ritual at the beginning to start and to end the performance. This is a shot from the nighttime when lots of people are standing with me. I always invite anyone to stand in the water with me for however long they want, and people come and go, and that's the way it's meant to be. Brazil was particularly hard because there were lots of waves. The water was much more wild than I had anticipated, but I was doing so much work with that community. We considered actually changing locations, but because there was so much work happening, beautiful work happening with the community, the site became really important. And again, I really didn't know if I would actually make it through the 12 hours and 16 minutes performance, but I had to try, and knowing failure was an option was part of it. And what I learned from this one was that resilience sometimes means letting go. The image I'm trying to create is one of standing still while the water rises slowly. But I realized in this iteration that sometimes you have to let go. I had to actually let go of my spot being so still in order to start this work. And one of my favorite stories from this, from Brazil, was that there was a 16-year-old, we had a 16-year-old production assistant named Vinicius, and he stood with me for 2 hours later in the day, and he told me that he lives right by the water, but he told me that during this performance, he began to see the water with new eyes, and he felt like a tree rooting down to the center of the earth. This is Pretas de Rua doing one of their moments of street poetry. This was how we marked the passing of the hours in Salvador. And this is the final moment when I walked out of the water, when Pretas de Rua came to collect me from the water. This is Vinicius in the orange on my left. And it was a joyful moment. Then I went to Kenya, and this was last year, almost exactly a year ago. And because of the choice to do a really urban, work in a really urban space in Salvador, I ended up, we were looking around Mombasa, but then with my collaborators, working with a team of all locals, we decided to venture a little further south, and amazingly, we're introduced to this incredible community, this village, Bodo Village, which is about an hour and a half south of Mombasa. And this community went all in. They really came out and all participated. It was the most robust participation in a way. This is the very beginning of the performance when they were doing a ritual. They sort of brought me out to the water and then continued to sing and dance for about 20 minutes as the performance began. Here's a close-up of one of the human clock moments later on, where they are doing this incredible dance. Here's a little bit into the performance when many people started to join me. This is high tide, and more singing and dancing. It was really incredible and really kept me going the whole time through. And the sun is setting, many people standing. And another amazing thing in Kenya was that we decided to plant these mangrove trees. The village already had a robust situation where they would grow mangrove seedlings. And so we decided, as part of the project, as part of the performance, we would plant another 700 mangroves, and those mangroves are growing. We have a nice and amazing bed of 36.5 mangroves that someday I will go back and see as they grow. And then this is just one more shot of showing the video work onto projecting it onto the walls of Fort Jesus Museum, which is in Mombasa. I always now make sure that I edit the video within 10 days of the performance, and then we show it in a public space before I leave. I don't have a shot of us showing it back in Bodo Village, but that was pretty amazing and beautiful, a beautiful moment. This is the map of the project, the locations that have been completed, and the two remaining. Aotearoa, New Zealand is, the image behind me is the test shot from Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is where I was actually when COVID hit. And so that work has now been postponed or suspended in time. And then Lenapehoking, New York City will be the final work in the series when the planet wills it with our COVID situation. It was all supposed to end this year, but now we have another year, maybe two. We'll see what happens. And this is my contact information. I'm really grateful to be presenting, to have especially Georgia now, all eyes on Georgia with the political situation right now. It's very, I'm really honored to have the work shown there. So. Thank you so much. And I can't wait I'm so excited to be in conversation with the faculty here. I think I'll stop my screen share. Okay, here we go.
All right, thank you, Sarah, for that wonderful overview. And I think that'll give us a lot of context and food for thought as we shift to the panel discussion now. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to introduce all the panelists first, and then ask each of them to share their reflections in turn. I also realized I didn't introduce myself. In the beginning, I'm Jeff Richmond Mall. I'm the Curator of American Art at the Georgia Museum of Art. But on to the more important introductions. Speaking first is Dr. Samantha Joy, the Athletic Association Professor of Arts and Sciences and Regents Professor in the Department of Marine Sciences here at the University of Georgia. Dr. Joy is internationally recognized for her work on the complex interplay between microbes and large-scale ecological processes in the oceans. But she's also a generous collaborator with the Wilson Center and the Georgia Museum of Art, having worked with artist Rebecca Rutstein on a 64-foot-long modular steel sculpture entitled Shimmer, which was inspired by bioluminescence in deep sea environments and which was recently purchased for our permanent collection here at the museum. After Dr. Joy will be Dr. Matthew Burtner, who is the Eleanor Shea Professor of Music at the University of Virginia. Dr. Burtner is a composer, environmental sound artist, and eco-acoustician. He focuses on human-computer environment interactions and is co-director of the Coastal Futures Conservatory, which is an interdisciplinary program focusing on sound, but collaborating across the humanities, science, and music. He's also the founder of the environmental arts nonprofit EcoSono. After that, we'll hear from Michael Marshall, the Josiah Meigs Distinguished Teaching Professor and Director of Social Ecology Studio at UGA's Lamar Dodd School of Art. As a photographer and educator, his research currently addresses social practice using art to engage the environment, sustainability, and resilience, particularly as all of those intersect with community enrichment and revitalization. And then last, we will have Dr. Stephen J. Ramos, who's Associate Professor in the College of Environment and Design here at UGA. Dr. Ramos has degrees in design, community and regional planning, and Latin American studies, and has published extensively on ports in the US, Europe, and the Middle East, including the Savannah Harbor in Georgia. As a member of the advisory board for the Leiden-Delft-Erasmus Port City Futures Initiative, he also has extensive experience with the coasts of the Netherlands, which we've heard about, and where Sunda's 36.5 performances began to be filmed. So we're excited to have him with us as well. So I'm going to, if all the panelists want to turn their videos on, I'm going to turn things over first to Dr. Joy.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks so much, Sarah, for this just amazing exhibit. Water's a big part of what I do, and I'm always really curious to see new ways of providing the public with the perspective of the interaction of people in water. And I love the way that the immersive, literal nature of what you're doing and showing how systems change over time, which is a big part of my work related to climate change. And it's hard to sort of see the kinds of changes that we're seeing over time globally. But when you immerse yourself in water and you experience a tidal cycle, it gives you a perspective and a view of the type of change that's happening on scales that you can perceive, and helps you, I think, better imagine some of the scales and temporal and spatial that you can't quite see. So I was really just blown away by the effect of looking at your exhibits and experiencing them on how different people perceive water, and doing it together in groups, I think, is also just a really unique way to get a perspective on a site. I spend a lot of time in the water, and I feel like when you go through that cycle, I'm really curious, and I hope you have time to talk about, the things that go through your mind, like what it's not just the water coming up and down, but how the whole environment is changing as a course of that tidal cycle. There's different creatures in the water at different phases of the tide. I mean, you surely have all kinds of really interesting interactions. So I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I'll pass along because I want to give us time to talk about it. I don't want to take up all the time just talking. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. So I just want to say thanks to the Wilson Center for the Humanities and Arts, the Georgia Museum, University of Georgia, and especially thanks to Sarah here for giving us the inspiration to come together and talk about this. I was so curious to hear how she started, Sarah, how you started the inspiration for the piece on the evening of the Hurricane Sandy. And I remember that night really well because it was the very same night that my opera on climate change premiered around the world. It's a telematic piece that connects musicians and singers from different points around the world together in real time and audiences. And that was set to go on October 29th in Norway, Canada, Alaska, New York, Washington, DC, Indianapolis, and Virginia. And we had this, this incredible storm hit the coast, and it canceled the venues in New York, of course, and in DC and in Virginia. And my band Eco Sono, which was one of the key parts of the performance, had to play from a bunker in Virginia just to the internet because the show went on in the other sites around the world. And so, I mean, I remember that night so well, and it's just amazing to think that that was kind of the end of that performance. I mean, we led up to that moment, and the climate change event disrupting the climate change opera was super ironic, but then also, it's exciting to see how it generates all this kind of new work around sea level rise and climate change, melting ice, and there's this point of contact around the hurricane. I love the piece, how it's, it's I guess a common, uncommon experience for a person to stand at the edge of the coast and look out and stay there for, what seems like a long time, sometimes feels like too long, like she should go back. But no one sits out there for a whole tide cycle. And it's really, I think, that tidal cycle that's so exciting about the piece, that it's a human form that is the performance by a human set within an environmental form. And what Mandy's saying about the tidal cycle taking us out of our normal sense of human form is a wonderful observation, that decentering practice that really allows us to think of ourselves in a broader context, which just seems to me to be one of the most important things about this. Reminded of the work of Marina Abramovic, who is clearly an inspiration, I think, in this performance art, one of the pioneers of that genre. And the differences, though, between this and that, because in this, it seems like Sarah's not so much the center of the piece, but more like a measuring stick by which we observe the tides. And by standing there, people have the chance to experience the sea, and they feel comfortable with themselves doing that. And then things evolve around that. And watching the films, you get the sense that the center of attention, although it's the drawing focus, the center of attention isn't the performance artist, but rather the interface between the human nature interaction. And the interviews that happen in front of the camera definitely support that. So I think that's really fantastic. The energy of the tidal force against the person reminds us that the world is not for us, that our planet supports us and that we're lucky for that, but it's not for us to consume and change to suit our convenience. It's okay that we don't own everything. It's okay if we're not meant to encompass everything. And so, I love this kind of counterpoint between the tidal force and the fragility of the human being on the one side, but it's also disguises a more disquieting power that the human holds over the environment. So magnified by billions, our behavior does alter everything. And we do change the planet. We pollute the ocean. We warm the atmosphere. We melt the polar ice. We cause the sea level to rise. So there's this really interesting irony disguised in this scene of an individual facing the tidal force, because in spite of the appearance, the ocean may actually be no match. So I'm going to stop there. There's a lot for me to ask about. I guess I have a question, which is about I'll leave this question about the relationship between the performance and the gallery. And this is a long time issue between in earth arts and is how the work of art exists in dialogue with the gallery. It's something that, Robert Smithson called, in his Earthworks exhibition, they dealt with that by putting up photographs. Dennis Oppenheim called it like a gallery disturbance concept that messes with the artwork. And so I'm really curious about the dialectic between the outdoors and the gallery. And then I would also like to ask Sarah about where we find the work of art in this constellation of mediation and performance elements. And I'll turn the discussion over here.
I too am super excited to be here today and to hear you talk about your work, Sarah. Thank you. What I do with the Social Ecology Studio really aligns in so many ways with what you're doing in this project. The mission of the studio is to really support projects that are engaging issues of sustainability and resilience, really thinking through two different sort of approaches or frameworks, one being about interdisciplinarity and the other being about engaging community. And I think your work does this in so many different ways in terms of the interdisciplinary practice. Not only are you integrating other artists in the poetry reading and the music that you're bringing into it, but certainly fields of science, thinking about the climate and the tides. There must be, I imagine, a really scientific element to your practice that you have to figure out where to stand to make sure the water doesn't go over your head, and where the light will be and what time you should be there to experience that exchange. I think about that science side of it. At the same time, I think there's also another strong field that's about physiology and psychology, about your just the physicality of being in that space and the psychology of sort of the endurance of being in that. I think about that a lot when I'm thinking about the work of what that experience is. And that brings me to think about the engagement with community, which is so much about audience. And I think about that also functioning in multiple ways in your work, in that you're coming into different communities to do the performance and engaging with community members ahead of time to build sort of a participatory aspect of the work that I think, one, just engages that community in thinking about the issues that you're talking about and activating them in it. And then there's the people that just happen upon it, which I think is wonderful because there's a wide audience out there that doesn't come to museums or galleries that we strive to talk to as artists. And by placing your work out there, these people stumble upon it and inviting people to participate. I think that audience is super exciting. And then of course there is the audience that Matthew is talking about in terms of the translation between the performance itself and the experience of the video in the gallery, which is the way that most of us get to experience the work. And finally, I think about sort of the audience of one, which is you and your experience of performing the work. And again, I think about the endurance aspect of that. And I think the word awe is one that comes to mind for me, in that it must be both incredibly magical and spiritual to experience that, and also somewhat terrifying and a real hardship to just imagine standing in one place for that duration of time, and then to experience this water sort of coming up higher and higher and enveloping you. On the one hand, it fills me with dread to imagine trying to endure that. And at the same time, I imagine it must be really sort of a magical spiritual meditation to be there and experience it at the same time. So that sort of meshing of interdisciplinarity and audience and engaging with broad communities is just so exciting in your work. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Sarah, and to the panel. I think some of what I'm going to say is going to echo some of the other ones, but I think that's okay. Just my experience with the films I really enjoyed. The things that came to mind were Empire by Warhol. One of my best friends, Nils Anderson, who's an artist, suggested I look at Kim Soo-ja's work, a South Korean multimedia artist, and her A Needle Woman project, that the multi-channel performances that she did, in terms of that kind of stasis within flux. And it's interesting, also sort of this idea of the modular Le Corbusier's scale diagram that we heard about, certainly the Earth works and Smithson. But the work wonderfully engages issues of embodiment, disembodiment, location, and dislocation, right? Sort of what Sarah said earlier in terms of hyperlocal and global. But also I think about, so Susan Cutter and her work on place-based resilience focuses particularly on issues of time and scale. And so in the work, there seems to be disparate temporalities and of course, nested scales, right? What we're looking at. And in this sense, COVID is interesting because it's one more step of dislocation, so that instead of that sort of uncanny cinematic experience in a dark room, we're actually seeing a streamed version of that dark room experience, which is just one more technological mediation of it. And when I went, it actually had glitches in it, which I really enjoyed, actually. That was one of my favorite parts, just sort of seeing how your work is as much a reflection on technology, it seems to me, as it is on the ecology itself, right? And also this idea, wonderful, that your impulsive poetic response walking into a harbor in Maine, but very much with New York on your mind and the events from Sandy before. So even conceptually, it seems like you have these interesting spatial complexities going on, but it is precisely that point where land hits sea that I'm fascinated with mostly. The Wilson Center has been speaking about this in terms of coastal thinking, right? And it certainly suggests a new kind of epistemology, a new kind of ontology, right? The work that I'm doing with an artist friend in the Netherlands, so on the North Sea, the artist's name is Jan Dirk Djekema, but there's going to be a volume out by Nancy Cooling and Carola Hein called Urbanization of the Sea, which is the North Sea, sort of thinking very much about ideas of planetary urbanism and the Anthropocene, but sort of engaging with space as something not so much known, but experienced, right? Sort of this idea, a space, not one that we live on, but we live in, less two-dimensional surface than four-dimensional sphere, a space where we can think from. So it would seem like your work in that engagement of coastal interface gets into these kinds of what Philip Steinberg calls fluid ontologies, which and also sort of recalling anthropologist Tim Ingold's discussion of a meshwork of natures, right? Again, these kinds of infrastructures, but woven and mediated through all of this, ecologies, but also sort of woven in these constructed infrastructural natures. In Steinberg's book, he refers to thalassography, right? The thalasso, water, but instead of geography, sort of land writing, it's water writing in that sense. So he says, the ocean as a material space is particularly difficult to grasp. It's constituted by vectors of movement, tides, currents, and waves, but these vectors do not simply occur in the ocean subsequently, they are the ocean. Baudrillard's observation about the map preceding the territory is as true at the sea as it is on land, but in the ocean, there's a further iteration because the territory washes away the map. Thus, we can never truly locate ourselves within the ocean, or if we must locate ourselves, we require a different kind of map. And on your website, you have these nodes pointed out of where the performances have taken place. And I think of that as a different kind of map, or an alternate map that you're beginning to conceptualize of territory and territoriality, but with this thalassography that I find really compelling in that way, the thing that you're talking about. That interface, the architectural historian Cor Wagner, who's from the Netherlands, talks about the land-sea interface as a breathing, living thing. And certainly we're invited to see the overwhelming power of the sea, but I guess it made me also think about how that's traditionally a dialogue, right? And sort of by silting and land being formed, as well as erosion and land being taken away, as you kind of bounce within that. So that's one of the things that also sort of came, brought to mind as I was watching it and enjoying it very much. A kind of an aesthetic subjectivity that's otherwise sort of, if we think of erosion studies, we tend to think of more sort of hard science approaches to this. So again, I think methodologically and epistemologically, I find it fascinating. I suppose what I was really interested, we started off the conversation with acknowledgements, which I think are important, of course, but I was certainly thinking about this idea of indigeneity and how ecological knowledge, what's tech, right? People talking about these indigenous knowledges, Julia Watson's work, low tech, the design by radical indigenism. When I see something like the Bay of All Saints, I think about the Yoruban tradition, Yemaya, and that's sort of to deal more with the Middle Passage, but certainly the understandings not only of, say, music produced by cultures where you're visiting, but their understandings of the sea and the way the sea must be an absolutely central part of their lives, right? So I suppose that's something I'd like to hear more your experience with, and if and how that influences your work and your thinking about it. But thank you very much.
Thank you all so much. Sarah, I think we can start with that question that Stephen just left us with, if you'd like to venture into it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, all of you, I just wrote down so many things because I feel like everything you're saying is resonating with different aspects of the work, and that we could have a very long conversation. But yes, Yemanja was very important in the work in the Bay of All Saints. That was actually the Candomblé ritual that I mentioned was Lebrisa, she put some beads on me, a beaded necklace that I then wore throughout the performance. And it was a protection. And then at the end, had some water and put it over my head. And that was something that actually, it was only in the few days before the performance when we had been working together for a while. It was something I had been learning about the rituals there in Candomblé, but I hadn't, and Yemanja and the vastness of the water. I mean, there's so many amazing things, the way that I love that all the religion is based on the elements, and that felt so real and important, and it's very present in all of my collaborators' lives. Like they practice and these ideas are embedded in their bodies and in their teachings, which I think means you have a different relationship to the elements. And so it was only a few days though before the performance when we were trying to figure out, okay, how do we start? How do we end? because it's different every time. And La Brisa was like, oh, I know. She's like, and she decided that that's what she wanted to do, was bring Yemenja into the performance. So it's not something that I would have asked for, but because it came from within the collaborative team, then it felt like it was okay to work with those ideas. And in terms of Indigenous wisdom overall, it's something that really has emerged and become very present for me in this work, going to Bangladesh, and then to Brazil, and then to Kenya, and then to Aotearoa, New Zealand, and really seeing the links, like tracking my new understandings and experiences of being in these places, and understanding the real trauma of white settler colonialism in each of these locations very specifically. And then especially in Aotearoa, working with my Maori collaborators and starting to understand more about the Indigenous practices that are so embedded in everyday life, and really feeling deeply that that must be honored, and that's actually the only way that I think we will, as human species, be able to survive in the future, if we can lift up this wisdom and lift up these voices and listen. So I've been learning a lot about that. I'm still on that journey, and as I work towards the New York work, I think that's a real focus for me in trying to understand and situate it in place in a way that honors the people who are Indigenous to this place.
So I also, I know we had another question come up in the course of these responses, and also anyone from the audience, please feel free to put a question into the Q&A box. I think I might have seen a raised hand come up. If you don't mind putting your question in there, your comment in the chat, that'd be great. But in terms of Matthew's comment about this translation of the performance as kind of a thing in itself into whether it's the screening that happens on site before you leave, or what we have here in Georgia, which is sort of a further remove. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that. I mean, I know it's something that we talked about in the course of planning the show, is how do we, given the constraints of our gallery, for example, but just more generally, how do we communicate the project to our audience in this particular place, which we also said is 4 hours in any direction from the coast. So did you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah. I love this question because I think about it a lot, and I think, I started out in filming the whole thing. The idea was, okay, let's try to really translate the experience of being at the water's edge, like of being with me for the performance, and being with the community. And see if that works, and that's still a goal in a way, but I think it becomes something really different when you're not sort of hearing all the real sounds from the place, when you're seeing it through these very specific camera angles that I've set up, and so I guess two things. One is that I really do think of these as equal works now. Like you know, often as an artist, you're sort of, well, what's more important? Is the video work more important, or is the performance work more important? And I really do think when I'm making it now, I think of them as equal. And so both works will be made on this one day, which is a little crazy, but I don't prioritize one over the other. They're both equally important, which I think is something that sometimes, you know, people will call it documentation, and I don't think of it as documentation. I think of it as this video work that I'm creating separately and together. And I think, you know, as I've shown it to people, it's really exciting to see it in 3 channels existing for so long at the museum. I've often shown it as 2 channels. I really love 3 channels because it just gives it a little bit more of a surround, allows, you know, to see 3 different moments in time as opposed to 2 different moments in time. But it is flexible in, you know, and ultimately I really want, you know, the vision is to have all 6 fully formed works in the same enormous space in multi-channel format. So imagine like a huge hall with, you know, 12 channels, 12 or 18 channels, all in the same space, all so you can be in all these locations at the same time, contracting space and time into one location. And another really important aspect of the video work is the sound, the music that is created by my collaborator, Joshua Dumas. He might be on this call. I think he was maybe going to try to listen in. But the audio is really, that's a whole nother layer too, because what we've done is, actually the one for the North Sea was created quite spontaneously as well. Like I thought I was gonna use the real sounds, and then it wasn't working. So I called Josh and I was like, can you send me, because we had worked together a lot before, and I asked him if he could create something within like a 48-hour period, and he was amazing and did. And then from there we've layered. So the Bangladesh work, audio is created based on some of the sounds that I collected and from climate data, and Joshua mixing that together, and then also attuning it to the North Sea sound. So the idea being that we can have all of the audio and the music can all live in the same space at the same time. It creates a very complex sort of symphony of sound. So that's just to give you a little more insight into that work. But the thing that also I'm really obsessed with in the video work is this idea, and this has kind of recently come into my understanding, but this idea of slow looking and really encouraging people to sit with it for a while, because I think when you stay with it, it is terrifying. Like Michael, you said the dread. It's like that's, at first often people will see it as like, oh, this is beautiful. And then if you sit with it for a while, then you start to understand the, you know, the complexities, all the themes that you guys have all mentioned. And you start to reflect, I hope then audience starts to reflect on it for themselves and have their own sort of perspectives come into play. But the time feels important to me in the viewing.
So just for the sake of time, there are questions that are popping up here in the Q&A box. So I want to try to work through a couple of them. One of them, if Sarah, I don't know if you can give just a brief explanation of 36.5 and why that number.
Oh yeah, sure. So the number is based on the fact that the day that I did the very first work in Maine is the day that I turned 36 and a half. So it is really about marking time, tracking time on my body in a very literal way and in a symbolic way. And that just sort of happened to be the case. I was in Maine, and I literally sort of had this aha moment on a Monday. I was only there for 10 days. Thursday was my half birthday, and I often, because time is my primary medium, I often do weird things in relationship to my marking the passing of my own life. And so I was like, oh, Thursday, perfect. I'll do it on 36 and a half. And then that's how it became 36.5. And I know people have told me it's a terrible title, but I still stay with it because it's important to me. But I guess, and it speaks to that sort of very individual, personal, but it's mysterious enough, hopefully, that it kind of relates then to the rest of the world. I'm always looking between the micro and the macro, and how can we take these questions in on a very personal, individual scale, and then within the community, and then as a civilization and as a species. That's what I'm hoping that people will kind of zoom in and zoom out.
And I've seen other further explanations about, roughly the human body temperature in Celsius, right? And related to is it the World Health Organization or some estimate of how much water someone needs for essential needs in a year? Is that right? There's some, you're the one that came up with, but there. Yeah,
I think I was trying to find all these other ways that I could prove that it was a good title, but it's true. There's a lot you can justify it in many different ways, but I hope that it's an evocative number that allows people to sort of wonder or think scientifically, or understand that there's a relationship.
Yeah. Well, okay. I'm going to jump over to two kind of related questions that came through in the Q&A. An audience member asks what preparation you sort of follow as you ready yourself for the performance. I think someone on the panel brought up this kind of, might have been Michael, this kind of stamina and endurance required. And then in relation to that, someone else says that they were struck by that stamina physically and mentally. How do you keep yourself going for almost 13 hours straight? What do you think about during the performance? So sort of the before and the during. I'm also curious about the after and the recovery, but thinking about that kind of physicality of the performance, if you can just say something to that.
Yeah, sure. So each time I sort of embark on a different journey with it, I do, I've done it now 7 times. So I sort of know that I can get through it, but it's also each time it has a really different challenge, physical challenge, depending on the site. And especially, another aspect is that as I do it, I'm getting older. It feels like it gets harder. And now that the postponement has happened, I'm like very nervous that by the time I do the last 2, I'm going to be like not in shape at all. But so I really think of this as part of the practice too. So I ask the community what they think I should do to prepare, and I take advice from anyone who will give it to me. I also do I have my own bits of preparation that I do, but I'm really interested in what the people who I'm working with, who live there, what they think I need to do in order to make it through this performance. So for example, like I will ask them to decide what the food that I need to be eating, what I need to be ingesting, or what kind of exercises I need to be doing. So like in Brazil, Clara, who's the anthropologist and artist who I worked with, she was teaching me these techniques based on gyrotonics, and we were doing, and then we were also doing lots of other practices in relationship to Yamanja. And then also Paolo decided he needed to cook me a steak, that I needed to eat a steak before I walked out into the water. So he literally brought like a steaming steak to the water's edge. I couldn't eat the whole thing, but I ate part of it. And that was the last bit of food that I ingested. So that's sort of, I think of this as part of the playful aspect of the work. Actually, it's not all totally serious, but I'm able to roll with the punches and try to like do whatever people instruct me to do. And then and then during, I guess, in terms of the endurance, it's every time it's really hard. It's not easy. But what keeps me going is really the fact that there are people watching. Honestly, like it's the fact that I've set it up as a performance, and that, so it's really like I am determined to do it. It's a lot of it is willpower, because I know that I've like put so much into this moment. And so I do this thing that seems impossible physically otherwise. It's really hard. Like I would not do it if I was by myself, just trying to endure it. It takes a lot. But so there's something about, I am thinking about the audience the whole time and trying to create this experience, and I'm trying to get through it for them. That's definitely key for me. And then afterwards, I usually, and yeah, it's cold, it's uncomfortable, but I think that discomfort is actually what we all as people, especially in the Western world, that experiencing that discomfort and really considering that in relationship to the water is an important aspect of the work. And then afterwards, I usually I get exhausted, but I'm also really, lots of adrenaline, and I always want to hear from people what their experience was, because I'm focusing on the sea, I'm focusing on the water the whole time, and so I don't always know I've set up the situation, so lots of things are happening on the shore, but I don't actually get to participate in them. So I'm always really curious, and everyone's always like, "Aren't you exhausted?" And I'm always like wired afterwards, just because. It's exciting. And then I sleep for a few days.
Well, we're just past 2:00, so I want to wrap it up here. But I think this has been a really just fascinating and exciting conversation. I think, again, I'm thinking about the title here about immersion and community, and how this kind of collaboration and community mindedness is so central, but also, to Stephen's great point about, the ways the work brings out these kind of different scales and relationships that are local and global, the different ways that all of us experience the same waters in different places. I mean, I was just really impressed by watching the Brazil video, which is coming up next week in Georgia. Just the violence of those waters in contrast to the kind of slowness in other places, which seems also kind of a metaphor in a way for our relationship to the environment, which sometimes nature moves slowly and can catch us unaware as it changes. And then other times there are these violent shifts that we experience, like Sandy, which inspired this whole thing. So just a lot of great, food for thought as we go out from here. I want to thank all the panelists for joining us. Thank you for your perspectives. And Sarah, thanks for sharing your work with us here at the museum. We hope everyone out there in the audience can come see it in person or watch a live stream. Yeah, thank you all again for being here.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate all of you, all your thoughts. I would love to keep in touch, and thank you to the Wilson Center as well. Also, Vivian, she wrote something in the chat. I wanted to just mention that there's a lot more background videos on the website and on my Vimeo channel. So there are ways that things continue, especially in Kenya. There's the mangroves are growing. The community is still doing things around the work. So I hope you'll all keep in touch. And if you want to stand with me in New York City, if anyone is there in the area, whenever it happens, I hope you'll join and follow along as the project continues. Thank you so much.